I am just me. I always have been. It's been nearly 6 months to the day the final chapter of Attack on Titan was greeted by arguments, rants, memes, and everything else the internet has to offer. Despite the general outlook softening in the months after release, Eren Yeager remains at the very heart of discourse surrounding the series. Some claim that all of his actions no longer hold any meaning, while others believe his conclusion only strengthens him as a character and protagonist. I'll be looking at his goals, motivations, the discrepancies between what he says and the subtext beneath them, as well as his dynamics to give a coherent argument as to why I believe Eren is still one of the best protagonists the medium has to offer. This video will also contain spoilers for the entirety of the Attack on Titan manga, so if you have not read, I recommend coming back at a later date. From this point, I'll be getting straight into the video, starting with his 4 main goals and motivations. Freedom. Eren's idea of freedom is a flawed, childish one that he gained when Armin first came to him with beautiful stories of a world out of his reach, a world he had been denied. An aimless 8 or 9-year-old, the look in Armin's eyes led to an epiphany that stuck with him his entire life, one of an amazing dream that he couldn't see. His ideals are more than an abstract concept because they represent the indignation one can feel in being trapped by their environment, powerless to do anything. Eren's beliefs are extreme, but the idea of being denied experiences throughout life simply due to the circumstances of your birth is one I'm sure many can relate to. He consistently gained strength from his conviction. He could feel it welling up inside of him with a mere thought. However, this only pushed him further down a rabbit hole of his own creation. This boundless freedom, overtly tied to Eren through the constant bird symbolism, present even in chapter 1 immediately prior to the fall of Shiganshina, is an ideal that is impossible to attain as there are always limiters to human existence. This is most obvious when they finally reach the ocean through the juxtaposition of Armin's reactions to his own, despite this being the dream they supposedly shared. He's so plagued by the memories of his future self and that of his past ones, along with what's beyond the ocean, that he is unable to appreciate the experience of the ocean itself. It's not enough. Armin, on the other hand, is overcome with emotion. This is what he thought they had worked so hard for. This experience in itself is freedom to him. Freedom is impossible to define objectively, and so, even when he gains the power of a god, the limitless freedom he wanted is still out of reach because his own desires do not fully align. He's prevented from fully carrying out one goal due to the existence of another one, which just adds to his inner turmoil. In fact, Isayama makes it clear that any concept along these lines, such as utopia or eternal peace, are fundamentally flawed as they go against human nature. If we are not limited by others, we will limit ourselves. This is evident in one of Eren's most iconic moments, the freedom panel. While it is true that on some level Eren views this as a type of freedom, this is that scenery after all. The overwhelming evidence and Eren's own actions and words go against this. Not only does he escape into his child form, symbolic of ignorance, which is, in his own words, the thing farthest removed from freedom, but the views he speaks of that he equates to freedom as a child are things he actually cannot see. In fact, the Titan smoke, which acts as pseudo-clouds in his flight, block his sight completely. How can he say that seeing these things means that he is free when he cannot see any of them at all? The Titans of the Rumbling also enclose him, acting as the walls that always reminded him of his lack of freedom growing up. On top of this, his final Titan form is that of an enormous skeletal puppet held up by strings. Towards the end of the chapter, we even see the real Eren, eyes closed to the horrors he has chosen to enforce, again held in place by more strings. Throughout the story, he is constantly depicted in chains, and this is no accident. It's merely further emphasis that Eren is tragically trapped in his pursuit of freedom. People may argue that his view on freedom developed as he grew up. However, by looking at chapter 131, we can see that, at its essence, this is categorically not the case. The island is to save Eldia, but it's more than that. What was really beyond the walls was nothing like the world I dreamed of. It wasn't like the world I saw in Armin's book. When I learned humanity lived beyond the walls, I was so disappointed. I wished for it. I wanted to wipe it all away. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Deep down, beyond it all, this was a selfish and childish dream, and he freely confesses to this. He is broken by it. Even the context of the confession to Ramsay heightens this aspect of selfishness and ties to why he's an even worse piece of shit than Reiner. The boy he confesses to is someone who is unable to understand him. Ramsay doesn't speak the same language, and it's therefore purely a desire to offload his feelings, not an honest wish for judgment, unlike Reiner in their basement conversation. This dream also perfectly ties to the final chapter. After being questioned by Armin about his desire to achieve the blank plane, he admits he doesn't truly understand himself. It's a commentary on nature versus nurture through his admission that this is something that, at the end of the day, is tied intrinsically to his very self, and it strengthens his parallel to Reiner even more by looking at his words during the declaration of war. This wasn't just my history or environment, it was my fault. Both boys moulded by their own traumas, but having that aspect of themselves that they may just have been born with. Side point, but this is also the reason Eren has the conversation with Reiner and pushes him with the questions of his own mother's death. It's speaking towards Reiner's mind state that led him to break down the walls, not the logistics behind the action itself, which is why this conversation remains utterly untouched by Eren's involvement with Dina. Eren has also never had a real answer to the question of why. He rebukes Zeke's plan as he just can't accept an end like that. He skirts questions by saying it's because he was born into this world. And finally, when Zeke asks him why he refuses to end the conflict, he says, "I am just me. I always have been." His facial expression, a direct parallel to chapter 139. Eren has never been someone who understands himself in philosophical terms, and this is something that doesn't change by the conclusion of his character, nor should it. The final nail in his freedom coffin is his inability to change the future. One of the core themes of the story is that everyone is a slave to something, from Erwin and Kenny to their dreams, Hanji to their role, Armin to his self-loathing, Ymir Fritz to a misguided idea of love born out of trauma, or Zeke to his own trauma. Eren Yeager is a slave to the very concept of freedom, but even more so, he is a slave to himself. He cannot change the future because, for all of his guilt, he cannot change himself. He saves Ramsay because, despite his conscious hypocrisy, he simply cannot allow the downtrodden boy he empathizes with to suffer in front of his eyes. It's simply not in his nature. It's Eren's truth in all of its ugliness. Everything he did was because he wanted to do it on some level. It follows a philosophical train of thought called compatibilism, which proposes that both causal determinism, i.e. the future cannot change, and free will, we are morally responsible agents of our actions, can coexist. Eren is still culpable for his actions despite them being set in stone, as they are the results of his desires. He is who he is, and he can never escape from that. Now this is something that leans slightly more towards interpretation, but you could view his desire for freedom as being so strong that it retroactively ties to all previous holders of the Attack Titan, as a symbolic representation of Ymir's desire for the same thing. Her innate desire for freedom was shown in chapter 135 by her freeing the 3 pigs with her eyes actually open, the 3 pigs working as foreshadowing for the eventual realization that it was her 3 children that she loved, instead of the king. This section of his goals and motivations was rather long, but it's the most complex aspect of Eren's character and one rife with talking points. He wants his friends to live long lives. This has also been a pretty contentious topic since the final chapters were released, but to me, it's also one of the clearest. That's not to say I don't understand points of confusion, but it's the easiest one of his goals to navigate as it's something that is corrupted the least from where it begins. He's had the desire to protect since he was a child, shown through his willingness to help Armin against his bullies. He attempts to stop Mikasa from joining the Survey Corps by pushing her towards the MPs as it's a far safer occupation. He's in disbelief when he is told he attempted to harm her at Trost, and he snaps for the first time in that same trial when people begin suspecting Mikasa of being a Titan too. It's a part of his nature, emphasized even in the Ramsay moment, that enhances the sense of rage, sadness and loss that comes with his trauma. This is evident in moments like the Levi Squad slaughter, where he feels complete responsibility for their deaths. This defines a lot of his actions moving forward from that point, a struggle in trusting others, while simultaneously feeding his self-loathing, which culminated in his breakdown at the cave. There's so many instances of Eren showing his love for his friends that it would be redundant to keep on naming them. However, the important thing to note is that this is a desire that sticks with him after he receives his future memories. If anything, it is emphasized even more. One such moment is in chapter 130, when Eren asks Zeke if there was a scientific explanation behind Mikasa's affection. This ties into chapter 123, but I'll speak about that a bit later. Zeke goes on to ask what Eren will do with this information, and he replies by saying that there is nothing he can do, that he will die in 4 years and their lives will continue long after that moment. He thinks of the moment Historia offered to have a child to allow him to fulfill his plan, which would not make her a breeding mare nor allow her children to be submitted to a 13-year death sentence for the sake of the island. The culmination of her own arc of being selfish with her desires that stemmed from Ymir's freckles. This is used here as an example of one of the lives that will continue once he is gone, a juxtaposition which Isayama is fond of, as shown through the baby panel in the rumbling and both the birth of Historia's child during the slaughter and in chapter 139 as the first born into a world free of titans. He goes on to explicitly state it is his desire for them to live and be happy, intercut with the memory shards of Sasha's death. Both Sasha and Hanji are examples of how Eren is both not powerful enough to achieve everything he desires, and how he has to compromise on one desire for the sake of his other ones. He went to Liberia to gain the power of the Warhammer and become a symbol of terror in the world's eyes, as well as landing a crippling blow to Marley's military, but as a result, Sasha dies. This is why he gets so angry at her death. His reaction is identical to the one where Hannes died in front of his own eyes due to his own powerlessness. He laughs at his own uselessness and hates himself, but it's an unavoidable consequence to reach his end goal. All he can do is keep moving forward. This all ties into the final chapter once again. When Armin asks him for the second time if this was really all done for their sakes, he simply does not reply, but instead walks away and changes the subject. Yes, a part of him did it out of love for his friends, but it isn't the whole truth. He even openly admits that he didn't know the fate of all of them before achieving the power of the Founder. All he knew was that Mikasa would survive, as she was the one who would bring about the end of the Titan Age. He was willing to accept this because he saw no other way, despite him clearly not wanting that fate for the rest of them, further adding to his inner conflict. There's also the train scene, which is the most overt display of his wish, and it also emphasizes how he does not want the culture of passing down titans to be carried on any further, giving Paradis a chance at survival and ending the Titan curse. I'm putting these two in the same category because they best exemplify the contradictory nature of Eren's desires. 100% security from outside threat, i.e. the full rumbling, means there would be no end to the Titan curse, and the end of the Titan curse means not completing the rumbling because Eren has to die by Mikasa's hands to free Ymir. Mikasa kills him in order to protect the surviving members of humanity, so if there was no one to save, she wouldn't do it. I've often seen people point out chapter 90 when Eren leaves the Titan alone on their way to the ocean as proof that he had grown past his trauma completely, when in fact chapter 139 provides a recontextualization that far better suits his character. He simply knew there was a chance that he would turn back into a human. Titans have been the focal point of his trauma since Shiganshina, and the irony of his child form, symbolic of ignorance, using the exact same wording as that first instance of trauma when starting the rumbling, is noteworthy. It's also important to note that it's not just the Titans themselves and the destruction they bring directly that Eren hates, it's everything surrounding them. Being forced to only live 13 years, forced to eat family and comrades, forced to maintain a system of breeding that essentially turns people into cattle. All of these things directly oppose his core ideology, which he even explicitly states while arguing against the 50-year plan. He is also someone that has always wanted to make a change, to make a mark, despite his imposter syndrome when he's first unveiled as a hope for humanity. He feels a huge sense of obligation towards this, to the point he says he will gladly give up his own life in order to change something, and he takes up this mantle post-timeskip. There are some very clear nods to this ultimate aim, the first of which is when he tells Zeke that he himself will be the one to put an end to 2,000 years of Titan domination, the wording specific and important. Another time is during a conversation he has with Mikasa and Armin at the firing range. While talking about the possibility of mutual understanding, Eren acknowledges that time itself is the problem, and that to buy them that time, they need to stop the enemy from messing with them, showing he was never adverse to the idea he ultimately went with, even when his perspective was the most narrow. Time itself, or more importantly the lack of it, is constantly emphasized post-time skip, and it makes sense the conclusion would therefore contain a resolution to that. Finally, when King Fritz's monologue of a world run by Titans is happening, Eren interjects and says he will put an end to this world, the one of King Fritz's dream. This is made even better thematically when it's revealed that it was not only his actions, but those of Mikasa which brought about this result, as it ties to a huge part of his character arc throughout Attack on Titan. It starts with Levi's squad, where he learns he can't trust others, they died protecting him, and he can't trust himself. He loses to Annie and needs to be saved by Levi and Mikasa. This is further touched upon in the cave, where he is fully deconstructed from the boy with a strong birthright to someone who wanted himself to die. Worldview shattered and suicidal, it takes the combined efforts of others to allow him to trust in himself once more. This is why Carla's speech in Bystanders is so impactful, reaffirming his conviction that he's special, not due to his abilities, but because he was born, which allows him to see beyond his own insecurities, emphasized in the talk with Mikasa and Armin prior to RTS. This all ties to his ultimate journey to find a balance between his own strength and that of the people he trusts, which is evident in Ymir's conclusion. Eren shows her determination and a desire for freedom. Armin and Zeke give her a broader outlook on the value of a life. And finally, Mikasa shows her agency and growth from trauma, the beauty in this cruel world. However, this result of freeing Ymir leaves Paradis not completely free from outside threat, so why does he accept this compromise? Well, not only does it again show his growth to believe in others, as he has full faith that Armin will be able to find a solution he never could. This isn't new either, he says the same thing at the end of Return to Shiganshina, but it also makes sense on a technical level. 80% is not just an enormous amount of casualties, but the rumbling would have also destroyed economies, infrastructure, military installations, factories, cities, and so much else. The existence of survivors alone is not enough to wage war, and therefore the possibility of immediate retaliation is simply not feasible. He isn't naive and thinking of it as a permanent solution, he is merely giving Paradis the time to stand on their own 2 feet, and trusting in people like Armin to make good use of that time in an era where Titans no longer act as barriers to communication and understanding. Moreover, a full rumbling would only secure Paradis from external threats. War is simply a part of human nature, and this is repeatedly stressed, from the past Eldian Empire turning on themselves when they ran out of enemies, to Flock's very own admission that all they were doing was making the world a smaller place. Brief spoilers for the Code Geass ending, so skip to the timestamp given on the screen if you haven't yet watched. People have compared Eren's actions to that of Lelouch, when the only surface level similarity is that both became a symbol of hatred to rally around, and even that is more of a consequence of Eren's actions in comparison to being the very reason Lelouch did what he did. Sorry about that detour, I just really hate the comparison as it doesn't make much sense. These have been all of his goals and motivations, and why they come together so well to give us the ending we received. Eren's Facade. I've put the word facade in inverted commas because I don't normally agree with it being used as a description for Eren post-time skip, other than a few key moments, because I view it as the logical path of his character arc, much like how I view chapter 139 as the same thing, instead of as the facade crumbling. It's another topic that has been contentious, and this is, in my mind, the result of trying to categorize everything that Eren does as either black or white, when in reality there are so many shades of grey. I'll start with the most obvious instance, which is the table scene with Armin and Mikasa. He isn't stupid enough to not realize the hypocrisy behind saying Armin is controlled by his memories when he himself just gained the enemy Warhammer, and through his conversation with Zeke, we know the story he told of Mikasa's Ackerbond is a flat out lie. He attacks both of their deepest insecurities in order to distance them from himself, which would help them to oppose him, such as when he lies and says that he has always hated Mikasa, despite him saying in chapter 50 that he would always wrap the scarf around her. Even here, at its most black and white, Eren genuinely reacts when Armin says he isn't actually free. He isn't a stoic man who has full control over his emotions. In fact, those emotions are very often ready to boil over, such as things like Sasha's death or his confrontation with Hanji in the cells as he pleads for another way. Chapter 130 actually shows us all the times he manipulated people in order to attain his goals. However, in each, we see more than a pure facade. He plays on Floch's nationalism and desire to survive to get him on his side, but at the same time, this is also before Eren had crossed the ocean and realised that they were people just like him. He could honestly view them purely as enemies, therefore I'd struggled to even call it a facade, as he had not yet adapted his perspective. With Historia, he needs to find a way for the military to not have her eat Zeke, and therefore plays on her underlying selfishness, while masking the true selfish nature of his search for freedom. But at the same time, he is fully honest when he says that merely standing up for her is not enough for him. The 50-year plan is just not good enough for all the reasons I spoke of before. Finally with Zeke, he is lying about being on his side, but he's fully genuine when he asks of Mikasa, and when he says he wants for his friends to live and be happy. All of these conversations intentionally overlap because they show the same thing. The two faces of Eren Yeager and the truth that becomes apparent when you take each conversation together instead of separately. What I meant when I said it's just the continuation of his character is best exemplified in Marley and then in Paths. In Marley, he has his entire worldview flipped on its head, and therefore he becomes more questioning and brooding in his thoughts, such as his speech to Falco, where he is not only ruminating on the idiocy of war, but also psyching himself up for the actions he will take. He is less outwardly emotional because he has to push down his emotions to carry on the slaughter. However, despite all of this, certain moments can change his entire expression, such as Willie exclaiming that he does not want to die merely because he was born into this world, or when he sees how much he has hurt Mikasa. In Paths, we see him get more confident with each step through his father's memories as he recognizes what is to come, shown through the change from Zeke leading the way to him saying it is time to go to the next one. He is honest when he tells Zeke that this is who he has always been, or that Zeke was wrong to look for a reflection of himself. They are ideological opposites after all. However, even here he ignores one of Zeke's questions as he watches the memory of him wrapping the scarf around Mikasa, showing his vulnerable and conflicted side. He also cannot contain his anger while listening to the king say that Paradis should just lie down and die, because this goes against absolutely everything he stands for. This even extends to his father when he is unable to turn, and Eren therefore looks at him with disgust and has to remind Grisha of his own trauma and anger. Despite this anger, his self-loathing and inner conflict still peek through as he looks on at the murdered bodies of children. None of these things are an act, merely the expression of who he is based on this situation. Even his monologues, both to announce the rumbling and to his friends in chapter 133, are not only to get them to realise killing him is the only way to stop him and to make himself the singular villain, but also because it's somewhat true. As stated in chapter 139, had they not stopped him, he would really have trampled everything, and that they were indeed free to oppose him should they choose to do so. His words again make sense based on context, and this also applies to the ending. One important thing to note is that Eren has already achieved all of his goals, compromised as they were, by the time of his conversation with Armin. He is the man who has seen beyond the hell, and is no longer moving forward as there is nothing to move forward to. The strongest piece of evidence for this idea that his fight is actually technically over once he ascends to become the founder isn't even introduced in the final chapter. We know through both Reiner and Ymir that shifters will stop regenerating once they lose the will to do so, which perfectly ties into why Eren never regenerates from the moment of the rumbling. He simply doesn't have the will to. As the regeneration is something intrinsically tied to emotion and not conscious decision, I'd even argue it's the only logical explanation for why Eren remains ahead. He is filled with guilt, regret, and self-loathing, tortured timelessly by the weight of his own decisions due to the nature of Paths and his role as the founder. He is also unloading all the pent-up feelings he has built up over the last 4 years to his best friend. I can understand people who thought the execution of his outburst was sloppy, but that's all it is, an outburst, and one he takes back immediately after. You may think it's cringe or pathetic, but that is what this singular moment is meant to be, and Armin himself even emphasizes this. Eren also says the exact opposite of this to Mikasa herself in a sequence that takes place chronologically after this one. Eren admitting he doesn't want to die, but understanding there is no way he will be forgiven, speaks to the genuine knowledge that he became the very thing he once swore he would destroy, and that he has no right to carry on after that. Eren has never once attempted to actually justify the act of rumbling beyond apologizing or saying that it was an intrinsic part of his nature, and we see the fallout of his choices through his brokenness in chapter 139. I hope I managed to explain how the use of the word facade isn't a blanket term that can be applied to all of his actions before the final chapter, nor that the final chapter itself is merely the breakdown of said facade. Dynamics. Eren's dynamic with Zeke is widely held in high regard, and rightly so, as almost every facet of their identity are completely opposed. Zeke's Beast Titan is literally a monkey, symbolic of the Children of the Forest theme, which speaks of trauma and the effect the cycle of hatred can have on children. Zeke is purposely constantly surrounded by trees of a forest to emphasize this, which works in contrast to Eren's Attack Titan being the very drive for freedom itself. Each aspect of one is reflected by the other. Zeke was brought up without parental love and yearned for it, treated as only special should he achieve the goals forced upon him that were tied to his blood. Meanwhile, Eren was the very opposite, a boy who was raised with complete freedom and love, someone who was told he was special merely for the fact he was born. Zeke is white-haired and clothed in white during the past sequence, whereas Eren is pointedly all in black with the same length black hair as Zeke, a potential reference to the yin-yang. Zeke's plan is the result of his trauma and the realization that he wished he had never been born, whereas Eren's is, among other things of course, a result of something more intrinsically tied to his nature, regardless of trauma, purely because he was born. In his conclusion, Zeke symbolically leaves the forest by being able to see the beautiful day for the first time, and wishing he had realized that it had always been beautiful earlier. The world didn't change, instead his warped perspective of it did. This is contrasted by Eren, who becomes a literal forest himself after his death, the overt symbolism tied to the horrors he committed despite already having his perspective changed by his visit to Marley. His treatment of Zeke is indicative of the coldest, most manipulative parts of himself, but despite his hatred towards his brother and what he represents, he still allows him to feel the warmth of parental love for the first time in his life in his interaction with Grisha. Perhaps this was only to play into the larger end goal of having Zeke sacrifice himself, but the fact that Eren both takes everything from his brother yet still provides him with the thing he truly needed further speaks to the duality within the protagonist. This duality can be seen in chapters 138 and 139, where Eren takes the people closest to him to the places that best embody their bond. For Mikasa, it is their shared representation of home, and for Armin, it is seeing the wonders of their childhood dreams. I've already spoken about the discrepancies in Armin and Eren's ideologies surrounding freedom and why Armin serves as his antithesis, but I'd like to briefly point out unspoken moments in chapter 139 which best emphasize this. Firstly, when looking at the volcano, Armin's eyes are wide with amazement, fully appreciating the sight before him, while Eren can only look at Armin's reaction with sorrow, fully understanding that he just doesn't feel the same way. This isn't freedom to him. It's the amazing dream that he can never see, even now, and it's such an important moment because it's a callback to when Grisha took Faye to see the blimp when they were children. Both Grisha and Eren share a desire to be free, but the difference in their expression here shows the difference in their characters. Grisha is genuinely happy watching Faye's reaction, unlike Eren, because his drive isn't as fundamentally selfish. He uses Zeke as a tool to further his ambitions, but he admits the faults of his actions and doesn't do the same to Eren, even giving up his duty as a restorationist because of his love for his family, as opposed to Eren, who pushes those closest to him away in order to complete his goals, even if they are still benefiting in some way. It's even Eren himself who manipulates Grisha by reminding him of his role in Faye's death in order to get him to kill children. This difference is highlighted through Grisha's words after he has lost everything and is talking to the owl. If I'd known this was the price of freedom, I never would have paid it. Eren knew that price through his future memories, but still decided to pay it anyway, and admits he would have done the same, regardless of whether his friends would have stopped him or not. Back to the differences between Eren and Armin, it's again pointed out when, after Eren speaks of his lack of certainty surrounding his ideology, Armin reaches out to the conch shell that was representative of his appreciation of the sea when they first went. These moments were enough for him, unlike Eren. To fully appreciate the complexity of Eren's dynamic with Mikasa and why the long dream in chapter 138 works so well for both of them, we have to look back to their arcs and the question Eren poses to her in Marley. I won't get into it too much as I feel the video is long enough as it is, but Mikasa and Eren have opposing character arcs up to the moment Eren gains the future memories at the ceremony. Eren begins to think less big picture and more about the people around him, admitting to the inferiority complex and jealousy that had previously caused him to lash out at Mikasa and view her care for him as a sign of his own weakness, while growing past it. Mikasa does the opposite, putting the good of humanity before her own attachments, evident in her allowing Eren and Armin to fight alone and not taking the serum away from Levi at return to Shiganshina. In fact, her attitude surrounding Levi is an obvious measurement for her growth, going from ignoring his orders in favour of Eren and hating him, to recognising the faults of her actions and wanting to atone for them. Just like Eren first gave her the strength to fight back against the sex slavers, she returns the favour both against Annie by reminding him of the cruelty of the world and against Dina by reminding him of its beauty as well. Eren's promise to wrap the scarf around her is indicative of his desire to provide warmth and comfort, something that he perverts by destroying that warmth at the table scene, which he hates himself for, despite thinking it is necessary. Eren genuinely isn't able to understand Mikasa's feelings properly, much the same as with Ymir, and this is both why he asks Louise to throw away the scarf and why he questions Mikasa herself. This question and the implications that stem from it tie both to chapter 138, and it is one of the best depictions of Eren's psyche that we have. This scene is Eren at his most lost and self-loathing, immediately after his breakdown with Ramsay, and he's even still crying from that encounter. He has just admitted he's even worse than the man who destroyed his entire life, and questions what his own mother would think of him, but the distinction between 131 and 123 is the most important part. 131 shows his inability to change the future due to internal influence. It was his decision to save Ramsay, whereas 123 is an example of external influence. At his most vulnerable, he surrenders control to Mikasa, someone outside of himself. Both her answer and the interruption are things genuinely outside of his control, and it's telling that his final act of resistance to the future is through a type of surrender. In both situations, it's almost like he is trying to reaffirm the inevitability of the future as a way of lessening his personal guilt and culpability, despite not truly believing this, as shown by the change of dialogue from "they are going to die" to "no, I'll kill them." Now we ask, why Mikasa? In his lowest hour, he turns to the one he's always viewed as stronger than himself, and the one who represents home to him, as shown during his inner monologue at RTS. Looking at the reflections of both himself and Mikasa, whose dreams and freedom will be robbed by his own hands, he's genuinely asking why she cares for a piece of shit like him. He even brings it up with Zeke later by questioning the reasons behind her love, unsure if she could truly just care for Eren himself, as he feels he is unworthy of that. Mika says he is family to her because she is unsure of her emotions and therefore equates the warmth and comfort he provides with the only other example of that she has experienced: family. All of these reasons are why chapter 138 works in the way that it does. It is the first time both can be genuine, despite, or even perhaps due to the fact it is not truly real, and in doing so are able to understand themselves. It's a type of selfishness that neither would follow through with, the full abandonment of the ideals and duties that had shaped their lives up to that point. Beautiful in its impossibility, yet still a shared craving from some part of themselves. Eren specifically has done this exact thing before, both during the battle at Trost District and immediately after his mother was killed. The idyllic life is not a wish of his that's new, but it's also merely that, a wish. The question he asks is therefore pointless, because it would never amount to anything even if some part of him wanted it to, and due to his future memories he already knows this. It further adds to his lack of control, but it also ties to his own ideologies. I wonder where it all started. Back there? No, it doesn't matter where. Even if this was all set in stone from the start, even if all of this was what I wanted, everything is still ahead. This is Eren. He truly doesn't care about the philosophy or distinctions, it just doesn't matter to him, and that's why it ties so well to his conclusion. He sees the future that he is ultimately content with, and he simply moves forward towards said conclusion, regardless of the external or internal damage that it causes. It's also extra proof that Mikasa was always meant to be more free than Eren. When she parallels the same set in stone line, she goes on to question whether there was something she could have done to change the current or future scenario, which is something Eren never did. Instead, he only followed them. The parallels are brilliantly done. I think this parallel is something that has been set up in the story from the beginning. using the juxtaposition of imagery for birds versus flowers as separate depictions of freedom that tie to Eren and Mikasa respectively. Flowers in AOT are symbolic of the freedom to grow while being rooted to your environment. In this world, it's emphasized by having them grow under or around titans, an explicit nod to their oppression, but how life can grow even then, the beauty in this cruel world. It's even highlighted on occasion, such as Armin noticing the flower growing inside of Eren's titan skeleton after he protects them. The beauty in this cruel world is Mikasa's theme, and tied not just to her view of Eren that she has maintained since childhood, fully encompassing every aspect of his identity by the end, but also to her desire to just live with those she loves and be happy with that, i.e. the concept of home. The emphasis is obvious during the confrontation with Dina, and her speech is what gives Eren the will to regenerate, the will to protect his own version of beauty in his own cruel world. Birds, however, are not tied to anything and are free with no limitations, out of reach of the Titans, which are the devils of the earth. They are often depicted flying over the walls, which speaks to Eren's view of freedom not tied to his environment. An obvious correlation would be the freedom panel where he's literally flying. It's maintained in moments like when Grisha is about to inherit the Attack Titan, the very representation of Eren's ideology. I also believe the final panel of the story heavily strengthens this interpretation. Eren in death becomes the source of life, a tree rooted to its environment but still reaching up into the sky. In the background we see birds flying around it, the two elements of freedom intertwined for the first time. It speaks to both the duality of Eren's character and the cyclical nature of AOT's world. Everything is connected, even in death. It could also be further emphasis on how, despite holding the ultimate power within him, he's still rooted by his environment and will never be truly free, unlike the way he views the birds around him. Overall conclusion. Eren is multifaceted, with contradictory desires, but I hope I managed to explain why in my mind his ideologies, actions and dynamics all tie extremely well to his conclusion. They make him a more realistic and human character in a story predicated upon the pitfalls of dehumanizing others, the entire point of the Titan allegory in the first place. It's also never a story of approval for his actions. Armin, despite attempting to connect to his best friend by thanking him due to his acknowledgement that he and the others are unwilling beneficiaries of Eren's actions, goes on to condemn those actions as the worst transgression. The others also simply carry on the attitude they've had throughout the Rumbling arc, as they are all crushed by the guilt of their own actions and their own history, and through this can understand Eren on some level. They also all benefit in some way, and their reactions are both a mix of these and the relief that they stopped global genocide. They killed Eren to stop him, and they would do the same again, these actions holding far more value than pointless posturing that would be out of character for each one. It's an attempt to step away from the hatred that has formed so many of their experiences up to that point, and their growth to be able to at least understand the situations that can turn people into monsters. That it isn't black and white, purely good or purely evil, that there is always a human being behind these atrocities. This theme of duality is also perfectly encapsulated within Eren himself, which is a cool take on transcendence. God and devil, selfish and selfless, victim and perpetrator, beauty and cruelty, freedom and slavery, hope and despair, and I love that. He ends the story riddled with guilt and tortured by his own sins, willingly killed at the hands of the one he loved and wanted to protect. A fittingly tragic conclusion to the tragic tale of Eren Yeager. I'd also like to touch upon the additional pages and how they do nothing to harm Eren's character for me before finishing. We are shown a panel of Paradis at war, roughly 80 plus years after Mikasa's death, judging by the architectural development. The reasons are left ambiguous as they are unimportant. It's only a commentary on human nature, whether it is conflict born from Eren's own actions or merely over something as simple as resources. Eren's actions did not solve world peace for all time, nor should they have, and these weren't even his goals to begin with. Saying Eren's character was meaningless is also missing the point for me. Were Alexander the Great's achievements meaningless because his territories were divided upon his death? More so, are all human actions inherently pointless because we will all one day be dead, or the sun will explode? It's fine if this is a philosophy that you adhere to, but it's not something that can be applied exclusively to Eren. The cycle was not solved by a child formed in the very image of that cycle, and that is just life. He even has multiple ties to the cycle itself throughout the story. the self-fulfilling nature of his memories and the extent to which he is moulded by them, his journey from victim to perpetrator, culminating in him indirectly starting his own cycle through the manipulation of Dina, and finally him becoming the fuel for another forest, most likely 2,000 years in the future, which would tie him cyclically both to Ymir, past, and the child, future. I also want to make it clear that Eren didn't fail in his objective to end the world of Titans due to these extra pages and the existence of the tree. The source of life, or whichever name you want to give it, is merely that, a source, and it is a metaphor for power in whichever form that takes. For Ymir, the Titans and paths came into existence as a representation of a trauma, need for connection, and fear of pain or death. The child will have their own trauma, and this may take the form of anything, whether good or bad, and the ambiguity is again entirely the point. Yes, conflict is intrinsic to human nature, but trying to escape from that conflict and find a solution to trauma is also just as intrinsically tied to humanity. A child in the forest is thematically tied to trauma, but the obvious differences to Ymir are also important. Ymir was chased by dogs, while this child is accompanied by one. Ymir fell into the tree by accident, while this child seeks it out. And finally, Ymir was forced and injured, while this child is physically fine with no evidence of external influence. Eren was the opposite of Ymir, but both were wrong in their actions. Ymir was too submissive due to her trauma and subsequent need for connection, propagating 2,000 years of Titan horrors, while Eren's trauma and his nature pushed him to the other extreme, and neither capitulation nor genocide was a solution to their problems. This child of the forest will attempt their own way, whether good or bad, and I find that idea both beautiful and perfect for the story of Attack on Titan. I'd like to say thank you to anyone who managed to stick around to the ending, and I appreciate you hearing all my thoughts on why I think Eren is still a fantastic character and one of the best the medium has to offer. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to the SCNK colouring team who gave me permission to use their incredible work for this video. I'll be linking their Twitter in the description down below along with my own. Please feel free to let me know your own opinions or to discuss it with others in the comment section, but I do ask that you keep it as civil as possible, although I know that might be me asking for a little too much. Based on reception and feedback, I will think of doing more videos similar to this one in the future and perhaps even create a Discord server for those who want to continue the discussion further for the things I was not able to touch upon. Thank you again and see you later.